In 1845, a microscopic fungus crossed the Atlantic and landed in Ireland. It was invisible, airborne, and it had a single target: the potato. For a nation of 8 million people, where almost half the population depended entirely on this one crop for survival, it was a death sentence. This wasn't just a failed harvest. This was the beginning of a 7-year siege by nature itself, a slow, agonizing collapse of a nation's food supply that would kill over 1 million people and force millions more to flee. This was the Great Hunger, and Gorta more. As the potato fields turned to black, stinking rot, a desperate search for calories began. But in a country already stripped of its resources, where grain and cattle were being exported to England under armed guard, what was left to eat? The answer was found in the margins of society, on the windswept coasts, in the ditches, and in the weeds growing between the cobblestones. Families were forced to relearn a forgotten knowledge, a dangerous science of turning the inedible into the edible. How do you prepare seaweed to make it digestible? What is the secret to cooking toxic shellfish so they don't kill you? How do you process government relief corn that is so hard it breaks your teeth? These weren't recipes, they were survival algorithms, passed down in whispers while the authorities looked the other way. Today, we are breaking down the 5 desperate foods that Irish families were forced to eat to survive 7 years of famine. Survival isn't theory, it's history. This is the prepper age. Number 1. Seaweed. For the starving families living along Ireland's rugged coastline, the ocean became the last resort. When the land offered nothing but black, rotting fields, the sea offered a grim harvest of its own: seaweed. But eating seaweed was not a simple matter of gathering it from the beach. It was a complex process of selection, cleaning, and cooking that stood between a family and starvation. 2 main types of seaweed became critical for survival: dulse and carrageen moss. Dulse, a reddish-brown seaweed, was traditionally harvested in small quantities, but during the famine, it became a staple. It was prized because it could be eaten raw after being sun-dried, which saved precious fuel. The process began at low tide, when families would scramble over slippery rocks to cut the dulse from its holdfasts. It was then spread out on the rocks or on stone walls to dry in the sun and wind. Once dried, it could be chewed like a tough, salty jerky. It was a meager source of calories, but it was rich in vitamins and minerals, which helped to fight off diseases like scurvy. Carrageen moss, also known as Irish moss, was even more important. This small, purplish seaweed is a powerful gelling agent, and it was this property that made it so valuable. When boiled, it releases a thick, gelatinous substance that could be used to create a semblance of a meal. The preparation was a multi-step process. First, the carrageen had to be bleached. It was repeatedly washed in fresh water and then laid out in the sun. This process of washing and sun-drying was repeated for several weeks until the seaweed turned from a dark purple to a pale, creamy white. This bleaching process was essential to remove the strong, fishy taste and to make the seaweed more palatable. Once bleached, the carrageen was ready to be cooked. A small handful of the dried moss was added to a pot of water or milk, if a family was lucky enough to have any. It was then boiled for 20 to 30 minutes, stirring constantly. As it cooked, the carrageen would dissolve, and the liquid would thicken into a thick, jelly-like substance. This jelly, often called blancmange, was then left to cool and set. It had very little flavor on its own, but it was a source of calories and provided a feeling of fullness. It was often sweetened with a little sugar if it could be found, or flavored with a few wild berries. The harvesting of seaweed was dangerous work. The rocky shores of Ireland are treacherous, especially during a low tide when the rocks are slippery with algae and seawater. Families would venture out in groups, with the children and elderly staying on the safer, higher rocks while the adults climbed down to the water's edge. The timing was critical. They had only a few hours during the lowest tides to gather enough seaweed to last for days. Many people were injured or killed when they slipped on the wet rocks or were caught by unexpected waves. Beyond these two, other, more desperate seaweeds were eaten. Kelp, a large, tough brown seaweed, was normally used as fertilizer, but during the famine, it was boiled for hours to make it tender enough to eat. The process was labor-intensive and required a lot of fuel, which was often in short supply. The kelp had to be chopped into small pieces and boiled in multiple changes of water to remove the salt and the bitter taste. Even then, it was tough and chewy, and it provided very little nutrition. Number 2. Indian meal. As the famine worsened, the British government began a program of relief, importing massive quantities of corn from the United States. This Indian meal, as it was called, was meant to be a lifeline for the starving population. But for a people who had never seen or cooked with corn before, it was a culinary puzzle that often had disastrous consequences. The corn that arrived in Ireland was not the sweet corn we know today. It was a hard, flint corn designed for animal feed. The kernels were incredibly hard, and the Irish milling system, which was designed for soft grains like wheat and oats, was not equipped to process it. The corn was often poorly ground, resulting in a coarse, gritty meal that was filled with sharp, indigestible fragments of the kernel's outer hull. The official instructions for preparing the Indian meal were to boil it for a long period of time to create a porridge or stirabout. A typical recipe called for 1 pound of the meal to be mixed with 4 quarts of water and boiled for at least an hour. This long cooking time was essential to soften the hard grains and make them digestible. But for families weakened by starvation and with little fuel for their fires, this was often impossible. The meal was frequently undercooked, resulting in a gritty, unpalatable gruel that caused severe digestive problems. The distribution of Indian meal was also problematic. It was sold at government depots, often at prices that were beyond the reach of the starving poor. The depots were located in the larger towns, which meant that people from the countryside had to walk for miles to get their rations. The lines were long and the quantities were small. A family might wait all day for a few pounds of meal, which would last only a few days. Consuming this improperly cooked meal led to a condition that became known as Peel's brimstone, named after the British Prime Minister, Sir Robert Peel. The sharp, undigested particles of the corn would irritate the lining of the stomach and intestines, causing intense pain, diarrhea, and internal bleeding. For a population already weakened by hunger, this was often fatal. As one doctor reported, the Indian meal produced a bowel complaint of a most formidable nature. The preparation of Indian meal required specific techniques that were foreign to the Irish. The meal had to be mixed with cold water first to prevent lumps from forming. It was then slowly added to boiling water while stirring constantly. The mixture had to be stirred continuously to prevent it from sticking to the bottom of the pot and burning. This required constant attention and a steady supply of fuel, both of which were luxuries that few families could afford. Those who had the fuel and the knowledge to prepare the meal properly found it to be a source of life-saving calories. The stirabout, when cooked for a long time, would swell to a large volume, providing a filling if monotonous meal. It was often mixed with other ingredients to improve its flavor and nutritional value. A handful of nettles, a few pieces of seaweed, or a little bit of milk would be added to the pot. Some families would add salt if they could get it, or a few wild herbs to give the meal some flavor. But for many, the Indian meal was a cruel joke. It was a food that promised life, but often delivered a painful death. It was a lesson in the importance of not just having food, but having the right kind of food and the knowledge to prepare it. The irony was that while the Irish were starving, ships loaded with Irish-grown grain and cattle were leaving the ports for England under armed guard. Number 3. Nettles and wild greens. As the fields lay barren and the government relief proved inadequate, the Irish people turned to the one source of food that was still available, the wild plants growing in the hedgerows, ditches, and forests. This was a return to an ancient knowledge of foraging, a skill that had been largely forgotten in a country that had become so dependent on a single crop. The most important of these wild greens was the common nettle. Nettles, which were seen as a nuisance weed before the famine, became a vital source of vitamins and minerals. They were one of the first green plants to appear in the spring, and they were rich in iron, vitamin C, and vitamin A. But harvesting and preparing them required care. The plant is covered in stinging hairs that can cause a painful rash. Families would use rags or clumps of grass to protect their hands while they gathered the tender young leaves from the top of the plant. The best time to harvest nettles was in the early morning when the dew was still on the leaves. This made the stinging hairs less active and reduced the risk of getting stung. The harvesters would look for young plants, no more than a foot tall, as the older plants were tough and bitter. They would pinch off the top 4 to 6 leaves, being careful not to touch the stems, which had the most stinging hairs. Once harvested, the nettles had to be cooked to neutralize the sting. The most common method was to boil them in water. A large pot of nettles would be boiled until the leaves were tender and the stinging hairs were rendered harmless. The resulting nettle soup was a thin green broth that had a flavor similar to spinach. It was often the only source of green vegetables that a family would see for months, and it was crucial in preventing scurvy and other deficiency diseases. The cooking process was simple but required care. The nettles were added to boiling water and cooked for about 10 to 15 minutes. The water would turn a dark green color as the nutrients leached out of the leaves. The cooked nettles could be eaten as a vegetable, or the cooking water could be drunk as a broth. Some families would save the cooking water and use it as a base for other soups, adding whatever other ingredients they could find. Beyond nettles, a wide variety of other wild plants were eaten. The leaves of the dandelion, the roots of the wild carrot, and the leaves of the sorrel were all gathered and added to the cooking pot. Dandelion leaves were particularly valuable because they were rich in vitamins and had a slightly bitter taste that helped to stimulate the appetite. The roots of wild carrots were dug up and boiled until they were soft. They had a sweet taste and provided a small amount of carbohydrates. Even grass was eaten in the most desperate of times. This was not a source of nutrition, but a desperate attempt to fill an empty stomach. The grass was usually boiled to make it easier to digest, but it provided no calories and often caused stomach problems. The knowledge of which plants were safe to eat and which were poisonous was passed down through families and communities. But as the famine wore on and the older generation died off, this knowledge began to fade. People would experiment with different plants, often with tragic results. The consumption of poisonous plants like hemlock and foxglove became a common cause of death. The search for wild greens was a daily gamble, a life-or-death game of botanical roulette. Number 4. Turnips and cabbage. In the landscape of the Great Famine, any crop that wasn't the potato became a target of desperate theft. Turnips and cabbages, which were grown in small quantities by some farmers, became a prize for the starving. These were not the carefully cultivated vegetables we know today. They were often tough, fibrous, and grown as animal fodder. But for a person on the brink of starvation, a stolen turnip was a feast. The main challenge with these vegetables was not in the preparation, but in the acquisition. Fields of turnips and cabbages were often guarded by armed men, and the penalty for stealing them was severe. The landlords and farmers who grew these crops were determined to protect them, not just from thieves, but from the starving masses who saw them as a source of life. The guards were often local men who had been hired for a few shillings a day, and they were armed with clubs, pitchforks, and sometimes guns. People would sneak into the fields at night, risking their lives to dig up a few turnips or to cut a head of cabbage. The vegetables were then smuggled back to their homes, where they would be cooked in secret. The theft of vegetables became so common that it was often the subject of court cases, with people being sentenced to months in prison for stealing a single turnip. The most common method of preparation was to boil them. A turnip would be peeled and chopped, then boiled in water until it was soft. The resulting soup was thin and had a sharp, peppery taste, but it was a source of calories and a welcome change from the monotony of Indian meal and seaweed. The turnips were often old and woody, having been left in the ground too long, which made them tough and difficult to digest. But they were still a source of carbohydrates and a small amount of vitamins. Cabbage was also boiled, often for a long time, to soften its tough leaves. The water from the boiled cabbage, known as cabbage water, was drunk as a thin, nutrient-rich broth. The cabbage leaves themselves were often too tough to eat, especially if they were from the outer layers of the head. But the inner leaves were more tender and could be eaten after being boiled for a long time. The preparation of these vegetables required fuel, which was often in short supply. Families would gather whatever they could find to burn: twigs, dried grass, old furniture, and even books. The fires had to be kept small to conserve fuel, which meant that the cooking process took a long time. A turnip might take several hours to cook until it was soft enough to eat. In some cases, the stolen vegetables were used to supplement the government's relief food. A few pieces of turnip or a handful of cabbage leaves would be added to the pot of Indian meal stirabout, adding flavor and a small amount of vitamins. But this was a luxury that few could afford. For most, a stolen turnip was a meal in itself, a rare treat in a world of constant hunger. The desperation for these vegetables led to a breakdown in social order. Neighbors stole from neighbors, and families were torn apart by accusations of theft. The turnip, a humble root vegetable, became a symbol of the moral collapse that accompanied the physical suffering of the famine. Number 5. Shellfish. For those living on the coast, the sea offered one last dangerous source of food: shellfish. When all other options were exhausted, the starving would flock to the shore at low tide to gather whatever they could find on the rocks and in the sand. This was not the kind of seafood that we eat today. It was a desperate harvest of limpets, periwinkles, and other small, tough shellfish that were normally considered inedible. The primary danger in eating these shellfish was food poisoning. The waters along the coast were often contaminated with disease, and the shellfish could carry bacteria and viruses that were deadly to a person weakened by starvation. The most common illness was a form of dysentery that became known as shellfish fever. It caused severe diarrhea, vomiting, and dehydration, and it was often fatal. To reduce the risk of poisoning, the shellfish had to be cooked thoroughly. The most common method was to boil them. A pot of shellfish would be boiled in seawater until the shells opened. The small, tough morsels of meat were then picked out and eaten. The resulting broth, a salty, fishy liquid, was also drunk. But even with this precaution, the risk of sickness was high. Many people, driven by extreme hunger, would eat the shellfish raw, which was almost a certain death sentence. The gathering of shellfish was backbreaking work. The best time to collect them was during the lowest tides, which occurred only twice a month. Families would venture out onto the exposed rocks and mudflats, often in the early morning or late evening when the tide was at its lowest. They would use knives, sticks, or their bare hands to pry the limpets from the rocks and to dig the clams and cockles from the sand. Limpets were the most common shellfish gathered. These small, cone-shaped mollusks cling tightly to the rocks and are difficult to remove. The gatherers would use a knife or a flat piece of metal to slide under the shell and pry it loose. A single limpet provided only a tiny morsel of meat, so hundreds had to be gathered to make a meal. The meat was tough and chewy, and it had a strong, fishy taste. Periwinkles were another common shellfish. These small, spiral-shelled snails could be found in the crevices of the rocks. They were easier to gather than limpets, but they were even smaller and provided even less meat. The gatherers would pick them by hand, filling baskets or bags with the tiny shells. Another challenge was the sheer amount of effort required to gather enough shellfish to make a meal. A person would have to spend hours on the slippery, dangerous rocks, prying the limpets from their holdfasts and gathering the tiny periwinkles. The reward for this effort was a meager amount of tough, chewy meat that provided very little in the way of calories. It was a food of last resort, a sign that a person was at the absolute end of their tether. The sight of the starving people on the coast, their faces and hands blue from the cold, their bodies swollen from malnutrition, became a defining image of the famine. As one eyewitness described, "I saw the dying, the living, and the dead lying indiscriminately upon the same floor." The shellfish, which should have been a source of life, became for many a source of sickness and death. It was a final, tragic irony in a famine that was filled with them. The gathering of shellfish also led to accidents and deaths. The rocky shores were treacherous, especially when wet, and many people slipped and fell into the water. Some were swept away by the waves and drowned. Others were injured when they fell on the sharp rocks. The desperation for food drove people to take risks that they would never have taken under normal circumstances. These 5 foods were not meals. They were the last desperate acts of a people pushed to the very edge of existence. They were the ingenious and often fatal solutions that Irish families devised when their world had been completely destroyed. From the seaweed on the shore to the weeds in the ditch, they used a forgotten knowledge to fight back against starvation. They proved that in a true crisis, survival is not about what you have, it's about what you know. The knowledge to turn the inedible into the edible, the waste into the worthwhile. That is a skill that transcends history. If this episode opened your eyes to the forgotten techniques of survival, hit that like button and let me know in the comments which of these desperate foods surprised you the most. Subscribe and ring the bell, because next episode we're diving into another chapter of human resilience that could save your life when everything else fails.